We have data on the number of women who were rescued. We have some details of the lock hospitals and the examinations. We have missionary and moral purity activist tales of rescue. And from the 1920s, accounts by Indian women's social activists about their work with fallen women. But we don't know much. Again, we do have information, but very little about the lives of these women. There are some, I was going to say, heroic efforts by scholars like Ashwini Tambe to to actually present us with traces of autobiographies, but there we still do not know much about these women. And it was this that made me interested in 20th century trafficking in the United States passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in 2000. And not to go into the background of this, but after this act was passed, the State Department began evaluating and grading the anti-trafficking efforts of other countries, but in the beginning, not the United States. These tip reports and reports on trafficking in India were reminiscent so much of colonial and international discourse that consistently found India rife with trafficking and the abuse of women. So it was out of this that I developed a workshop with Calcutta University, this women's studies program for students at my university. The workshop was held in Calcutta on sex trafficking and responses to this issue. So we had lectures and seminars. I think people who are here, both Boitali and Paula participated in these, were among the people who talked to my students. But we also visited Durbar, rescue homes, met with NGOs involved with prevention, rescue, and rehabilitation. We emerged from this. We heard abolitionists, regulationists, rescuers, social workers, and sex workers, particularly Durbar. But we emerged from all this with more questions than answers and no sense that we really kind of grasped some of the things that were going on. I think we were struck by the fact that we heard very little about how the women in sex work understood their lives. There were, though, young women in brothels who told us they were very happy with the work they did, but when we were leaving, they asked me if I would marry them to my son. We met girls in rescue homes who told us also they were happy, but newspaper accounts carried articles about their attempts to escape. And many of the social workers who spoke with us shuddered at the thought of anyone, any woman, having sex with more than one partner. And it's out of this kind of interest and ambiguity and so on that I organized this panel on trafficking in 2014. I was really interested in time in sharing some of the most interesting perspectives on trafficking and efforts to save women that I heard during these years. And I think I'm delighted Ajay and Barnali add this dimension that's not there in much of the literature by focusing on Northeast India. Paula focuses on, out of her own research, which is so much on borders and migration, she focused on the complexity of trafficking in a world where migrants, refugees, and displaced persons are not only vulnerable for trafficking, but the terms themselves seem often interchangeable. Boitali and Kim present us with this actually testimonies of rescued women, Bangladeshi women being repatriated and women in Hyderabad. And Shamita always with fabulous work about the questions of women's mobility and traces this out to connect women's migration, trafficking, women's labor, and marriage. And I think what I like is that these authors put women and girls at the center of the discussion. And I think remind us that these are living, breathing, dreaming individuals that actually deserve the respect the Supreme Court is talking about. So thank you. I'm delighted that we're going to hear from all the panelists. So Sweta, do you want me to introduce? Okay.
Yes. So you can introduce the panelists, and can we have Dr. Samita Sen presenting next, because we have kept it according to the 2016 order. So also because since you focused on the historical aspect of this subject, thought let's continue the discussion around history, colonialism, and trafficking.
Yeah,
If Dr.
okay,
Sen
thank
is
you.
okay.
Thank you very much. As Jerry has already flagged, what I was trying to do, which is connected to the work I have generally done in the last 20 years or so, which is to try and connect these questions rather than sort of treat these questions in silos, connect these questions to broader labor and migration questions. So one entry point, I will sort of emphasize three issues that was there in the article, but which connects also to my own other work. One is the question of marriage, and why marriage is so central, because from the time the census began, 1881, it has been noted that the majority of migrants within India are women. 75% or so, more or less stable over half a century. Proportion of women of migrants are women. Now, this is attributed to marriage migration, because in North India, all women, because of village exogamy, all women marry outside their village. So given the definition of migration in the census, all married women then become migrants. So that is noted but kept aside. And that itself, so that is not counted as migration, and it is not studied, especially in relation to labor migration. And this is something I've been hammering at for the last 20, 30 years, that you need this. This is marriage migration is not devoid of labor content. Because in a country where the vast laboring activity is in the households, marriage is the institution which allows the formation of that household. So it is the central tenet of laboring arrangements. So we have to take into account marriage and migration in order to understand anything about labor migration. So that is my entry point. But what then I go further into looking is the question of migration and trafficking. We all know that migration and trafficking are very difficult to distinguish. But if we are to approach it conceptually, so empirically they are sometimes difficult to distinguish, sometimes not. Sometimes you can distinguish it. But how do we approach it conceptually? And to me, if we use the term trafficking, we are alluding to a process, not to social actors. So if we think of traffickers, of people who are doing the trafficking, then we enter a domain of of identifying social actors and the activities in which they are undertaking. Which means then that what is crucial here is intermediation. What is the form of intermediation? So all kinds of migration. There was a time when we used to think of some kinds of migration being free and other kinds of migrations being assisted. But now migration studies has developed in a direction which shows us that actually this is not a binary, it's a spectrum. Some people are more assisted, some people are less assisted. But there is no such thing as spontaneous migration. There are always processes around migration. Once we recognize this, then the binary between migration and trafficking also opens up for us. And then we look at the different forms of intermediation that is always ubiquitously there in all mobility. And once we do that, we can look at, so one important intervention internationally in the context, say, of Palermo Protocol in trafficking is to also point out the term trafficking comes from slavery. So it is only in the early 20th century, particularly in the 1920s, that the term trafficking became so closely associated with sex work. This is new. If you take an earlier history, then in fact, sex work was only one among many things that involved trafficking. So if we open up the historical contexts of many of these issues, then we can actually position sex work and sex trafficking within a broader range of relationships. And that is one of the things I was trying to do in this paper, which is to show how, in fact, say, domestic workers and their migration is also, there are evolving forms of intermediation involved. Plantation workers, their migration also involved processes, forms of assistance, which are not unlike what we think of as trafficking now. So there are many forms of intermediation in labor migration that resemble trafficking. So the question that we have to ask ourselves, very importantly, is what is distinctive about sex trafficking today? And what sets it up? Will somebody tell? I didn't look at the time. I was asked to speak for 5 minutes. How am I doing for time? Sorry?
Please continue. You can continue.
For another minute or two?
Yes.
Yeah.
More than that, yes.
Yeah. So the question then is, what sets apart sex trafficking from these other kinds of trafficking, other kinds of migration, intermediation in migration? There is another historical angle why marriage is so important is because, like Jerry was talking about the Contagious Diseases Act in 1868. It was passed in 1868 and withdrawn in 1890s. Now, in that 25-year period that the Contagious Diseases Act was in operation, one of the things the British found almost impossible to do is to distinguish what they called prostitutes, registered prostitutes, and clandestine prostitutes. And the category clandestine prostitute grew and grew until it included virtually the whole of the population of poor women. In a particular city. Let's take the context of Calcutta. So, in a sense, that definitional complexity grew from their inability to understand marriage. Because ultimately, to their view, it is marriage that makes the difference, right? If you're married, then if married women's sexual relation and not married women's sexual relation is the major dividing line. But in a society where you have concubinage, temporary marriage, different forms of live-in relations, slaves, domestic slaves who also perform the task of sexual service. How do you distinguish? What is the big dividing line? How do you take marriage as a dividing line? So in those terms also, not only the mobility that creates the urban market for sex work, but also the very definition of what is a prostitute, who is a sex worker, that also foundered because of the difficulty of defining marriage. And that is not only a 19th century story. That remains even today a complex issue, especially among the urban poor, where marriage registration practices are very infrequent. You have all forms of marriage, from garlanding each other in a temple, that is also marriage, to formal forms of marriage. So given that the marriage in India is very slippery, so the slipperiness of migration and of mobility and intermediation and the slipperiness of marriage combine to create a field in which definitions are very difficult. And because laws are often created on these slippery foundations without taking into account the malleable and flexible and fluid nature of the categories on which the law is being made. So I think one of the lessons of the failure of colonial laws is how difficult some of these categories and the laws based on them are. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that excellent presentation. Dr. Forbes, do you want to comment something right now, or should we move on to the next presenter?
I think it would be good to go on to the next one. I'm concerned that we hear from everyone.
Okay, so I invite Dr. Kimberly Walters to make her presentation.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning. I am very honored to be here, and I'm grateful to EPW, Engage, and especially to Professor Forbes for orchestrating this today, as well as especially for that seminal guest editing that Professor Forbes did in 2016. I'm going to try and share a few slides here. Let me see. So I'll be updating the research that I published in 2016 in EPW under Professor Forbes' editing, with some research that was done by me as well as my collaborator Aramira from Women's Initiatives in Tirupati from 2018 to 2019. And I'm sharing this information with you in order to contextualize the Prajwala 2026 judgment by the two justice bench. So in 2018 and 2019, a group of researchers from WINS, as well as my two long-term collaborators, Dr. M. Ravikant and Arshad Khan, we conducted research in 15 protective homes, 14 of them in Andhra Pradesh, with the support and help of the Department of Women and Child Development, as well as one in Telangana. And in that time frame, we found that in these homes, these protective homes, there were 156 women who were being held, some of them under Swadhar schemes and some of them under Ujjwala schemes. The Ujjwala schemes, which held women under the ITPA, the legislation at question in the Prajwala judgment, they numbered 43 at the time. Of those 43 women who were held under the ITPA, 32 consented to give us interviews. And of those 32, we found that the vast majority 84%, had entered sex work voluntarily initially. 2 of them had entered sex work forcibly. So they fit the definition, the Palermo Protocol's definition of having been trafficked. But those 2 were not the same 2 who were being forcibly trafficked at the time that they were rescued from their situations by police and NGOs. So that at the time of rescue, only 2 of the 32 women that we interviewed considered themselves to have been trafficked at that time. Of the women that we interviewed, the vast majority of them were experiencing psychological distress as a result of their detention under the ITPA, largely because they were cut off from their families. They were unable to continue in their role as the primary breadwinner in their family, supporting their dependent parents or their dependent children. And they were also kept without a defined timeline. They were largely unaware of how long they would be kept under ITPA detention. And they often felt talked down to and treated as criminals rather than as adult women who were rights-bearing citizens or rights-bearing individuals in this context. We also found that the majority of women were not interested in the kinds of training that were offered in these protective homes because they did not offer a good alternative to the earnings that were available to them in sex work. So that we had several other findings, but these were 4 of them that are key to understanding the failings of the ways in which the ITPA was being administered in 2018, 2019 in these jurisdictions. I'd like to point out that while it is very exciting that the Supreme Court justices and their excellent clerks included empirical research, both historical and sociological, ethnographic, in their judgment, and while I was very excited to see this, I was disappointed, as were several others, by the fact that no sex worker collectives statements, no sex worker collectives research were cited, and that my work and that of many other scholars is only possible because of the sex workers who've already established so much knowledge and collectivized and built the infrastructure upon which and with which the rest of us are able to conduct our work. So I wish that their voices had been included in this judgment rather than mine. But I'd like to point out that although very excited about the Supreme Court's judgment, I note that the actual structure that is in place has not truly changed with this judgment. That while Buddhadev 2022 was quite revolutionary in terms of how the ITPA should be set aside in favor of women's liberty, women's agency, women's own voices, there are some loopholes in the Prajwala judgment that need to be flagged as potentially maintaining the same forms of vulnerability that sex workers already experience under the ITPA. So, for example, paragraph 352, although magistrates are instructed to place the women's own voices as primary, ultimately it's left up to them whether or not they want to do that, because they are given the mechanism to override the agency and the voices of the sex workers themselves, and instead determine whether there is, quote, coercion, tutoring, or undue influence on their own. And there is no evidentiary standard that is included for this determination on the part of the magistrates in the judgment. I'll also note that there is a 7-day inquiry period that is put in place that is handed over to the social workers or related parties to determine whether or not a sex worker who claims that she is in fact working voluntarily can be trusted that she is in fact speaking the truth. And that inquiry, the 7-day inquiry, is handed to people who may have some interest in the outcome of the inquiry, in the sense that their overlap with the protective homes may mean that they are incentivized to prefer to designate women as involuntary sex workers rather than voluntary, and that is currently a practice in place that is problematic, and it is not. It is kept in place and not undermined in this new judgment. Regardless, though, of who conducts the inquiry, one of the most concerning points is the 7-day period that is put in place with this judgment, because if you can imagine being disappeared off the streets for 7 days, not allowed to speak to your family, not allowed to earn, not allowed to pay for your rent, pay for your children's school fees, pay for food in that 7-day period, the biggest danger to sex workers is that period itself, that those 7 days, that their reputations will be harmed by notification to their families, but that they will not be able to conduct their day-to-day lives. So regardless of whether they're found to be voluntary or involuntary at the end of the inquiry, they are subject to a period that will, based on my research and that of the WINS team, will cause them a great deal of harm in both financial and reputational ways. I'm also concerned by the extended period of follow-up that is underscored in this judgment, in that it is not the locus of control for this follow-up is not placed with the sex worker. It is not a voluntary circumstance. She is not given the opportunity to reach out for ongoing continued support, but instead that is placed as the locus of control there is placed with the social workers, with the court to follow up. And from our research, we found that these forms of village inquiries and follow-up from the state's employees and NGO staff can oftentimes create reputational harm in the neighborhood or in the villages of these women who have been released from protective custody. And we would note that these ongoing forms of state care can, in fact, create forms of state punishment. And we would note that although the values that are expressed in this judgment are excellent, the structural forces at play have not changed, and we would like to see those structural forces changed so that a woman's agency is not doubted, that first and foremost, she is given the right to consent to be rescued, and that if she does not consent, that, as we often say in the discourse around consent, no means no. That if she does not state that she wants to be rescued, she cannot, her word and her agency cannot be overridden by social workers or that of the magistrate. Rescue and rehabilitation should never be forced. Ultimately, we think that the ITPA is not as strong of a source of support for women's agency and their voices as the BNS section 143 and 144, which do, following up on Dr. Shane's points, they do these sections of the VNS do disaggregate coercion-based trafficking from voluntary adult sex work, which the ITPA does not, which the Supreme Court itself recognizes that the ITPA conflates these two, and it in fact builds upon that conflation. So we'd like to see the ITPA and its conflation relegated to history, and instead the disaggregation of voluntary and involuntary sex work made the functioning law of the land. So I will go ahead and turn the time back over to the rest of the group, and note that I'm happy to discuss this at greater length in our period later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Walters, for such an excellent presentation and for a close reading of the judgment. Now I invite Dr. Anjali Newmai to make her presentation.
Thank you so much, EPW, for hosting this panel discussion. I'd like to begin by thanking Geraldine Forbes for bringing all of us together, and very excited that this work has been acknowledged in the Supreme Court judgment, Prajwala versus the Supreme Court, the Union of India, 2026. My study of trafficked girls and women from the Manipur Hill districts, particularly the tribal girls and women, highlights the perspective of shame, silence, and stigma. My argument is that the judgment supplies the architecture, and our studies supplies the test of whether that architecture reaches the margins. And this judgment's, I think, central conceptual move is the shift from rescue as an event to restoration as a continuum. And the court insists that the real test lies after the raid, in the rehabilitation, in reintegration with the family and relatives, and in treating the survivor as a rights-based citizen. My empirical finding in Manipur is not the trafficking itself. It is that not one victim in my study received financial assistance, that the Prajwala scheme's promised seed money never arrived, that police were trained until 2013. I started my work in 2008. Till 2013, the police in Manipur were untrained, and that only 8% received any vocational training, and none received a job offer. So my study is field evidence for exactly the institutional vacuum the Supreme Court judgment, the Prajwala judgment's direction are meant to fill. The judgment names the obligation and the ethnographic work, the ethnographic measures its absence. But here is my claim, that the Manipur case of human trafficking reveals two things that this Prajwala judgment framework, for all its ambition, does not fully see. First is race. The Prajwala judgment thinks in the universal grammar of the human traffic victim. But my study shows that Northeastern women in the sub-Himalayan region are trafficked through a specific racial script, mistaken for girls and women from the Far East countries or Nepali. Fetishist stereotype as loose. A pan-Indian rehabilitation protocol that is blind to this racialization risk delivering procedurally correct but culturally hollow remedies. The survivors from Tamenglong district, Manipur, is not an abstract victim. She is racialized at every stage in the trafficking, in the media's apathy, and potentially in the shelter home itself. So the colorblind rehabilitation cannot restore a survivor whose harm was color-coded. My second point is that trust as the very medium of harm. Prajwala judgment, like most anti-trafficking jurisprudence, imagines the trafficker as a criminal outsider to be prosecuted. In Manipur and also in other parts of Northeast, the trafficker is the neighbor, the co-tribesman. And also in my study between 2008 to 2013, I found some of the pseudo-theologians were involved, whom villagers trusted. And then the last is the placement agency or the agent, who is trusted again because he charges a fee. I recall when I asked these women, survivors, they said their parents arranged 4,000 rupees, 3,000 rupees to arrange for their passports and for their visas. So that trust is because the agent charges fee. So here the kinship network that the Prajwala judgment might treat as a safe destination of reintegration is the same network that enable the trafficking. Now this complicates the judgment's neat continuum. In close-knit tribal societies in the Northeast, the community is simultaneously the site of betrayal, and at the same time, it becomes the site of recovery. The tribal community is a close-knit community-based society. So my study's finding of near zero re-trafficking and 90% of respondents' reintegration is the redemptive half of that same paradox. Now, what we learn is that the genius is to make rehabilitation a justiciable obligation. And its blind spot is to assume that a uniform national protocol can land evenly on a country of racially unequal margins. So my study in Manipur is the corrective footnote the judgment needs. It says in effect that directions written in New Delhi must be implemented in the far Tamenglong district in Manipur, or Chandel or Sanapati or Ukhrul district in Manipur by people who understands race and racial discrimination within India, who understands kinship and the specific silence of a human traffic survivor, who answers every question with a single word, ashamed. Huge majority of my respondents told me, within quote, I feel ashamed. Let me close by saying that the Prajwala judgment moves us from victim to survivor, from event to process. My study in the Northeast, particularly in Manipur, reminds us that this movement is not automatic. It must be localized, racially literate, and community sensitive. The judgment is definitely the promise which we are celebrating today, But the ethnographic work that we all do is the audit. And the distance between them, the distance between a direction and a delivered remedy, is precisely the distance our institutions have yet to travel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Newmai. You said the ethnographic work is the audit, a very powerful sentence, I must say, a very powerful idea. And you have highlighted the many complexities of this issue, especially the question of kinship, trust, the issue of race, something that many in the public discourse or even in the public discussion may not be highlighted at all. Thank you very much for that presentation. I now invite Dr. Barnali Das to make a presentation.
Am I audible?
Yes, Dr. Barnali, you are audible.
Yeah, sorry, there's a lot of connectivity issue that's happening today. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. And thank you, EPW, for organizing this webinar. And also to Professor Forbes for giving the opportunity to contribute in this special issue and also bringing us together and reflecting on this very important issue that we are all discussing today. Thank you, EPW, for the chance to revisit a special issue that shaped my early thinking as a researcher. My paper was titled as "Who Would Like to Live in This Cage? Voices from a Shelter Home in Assam." Did not begin with an abstract thesis. I'm just taken back to my journey when I started with the whole process of doing research in this area. And I was a very young researcher then, still learning, but already clear about questions of agency, choice, subordination, and marginalization. I went into a shelter home in Assam with research objectives. Chief among them was to listen to the voices of rescue traffic victims themselves. I spent 2 months there, living with them, being with them for 8 to 10 hours a day, present alongside the residents well beyond the formal interview. In that sustained presence, my paper's central concern sharpened: the politics of rescue, surfacing gradually from what I was hearing. Existing scholarship was thin here because most of the research was talking about causes and the legal architecture of rescue and others, and there were very sparse research on the institutional life that followed after rescue. And that absence became my question, and it is why I turned into a micro-qualitative method of sustained presence and in-depth interview rather than official statistics, which let me see the shelter home not as a policy category, but as a social world with its own hierarchies and quiet coercions. That closeness revealed contributions between the scheme stated goals, which is prevention, protection, rehabilitation, restoration, and reintegration with dignity, and also documenting the daily lives within the home. Residents often describe that their dissatisfaction with food, clothing, the amenities, when funds were specifically allocated for purposes for these. Movement was tightly restricted, ostensibly which was said that it was for the protection of the victims. But the language that was used while talking about these protection was within the paradigmatics of moralistic assumptions, speaking of female sexuality, treating them as morally compromised subjects requiring corrections rather than care. Staff attitudes were shaped as much by religious and ethnic hierarchy as not by any rehabilitative philosophy, showing how caste, religion, and ethnicity inflict post-rescue experiences in the Northeast, and referring to what Kimberley has said, that referring to the current Supreme Court judgment as well, that whether when we lay the trust on the social workers, are they trained to understand the consent versus the coercion politics? And several women who wished to return to their families were often found themselves detained for longer than a year, 2 years, and then the institutional logic could explain that, raising the question of who the continued presence of these victims was actually serving. None of this was intended as an indictment of any single institution, but my argument was and remains structural. The architecture of rescue can reproduce the very confinement it claims to dismantle. And without genuine attention to agency and testimony, rehabilitation risks becoming a second, softer captivity. But I would also reiterate that whether it is softer or harsh, because those captivity, that the lived experiences of those women were very restricted, and they felt frustrated most of the times. The women I spoke with were never simply victims. They compared the shelter homes unfavorably to the brothels that they had left. They attempted to escape and asserted their right to return home in their own words. And also, most of the times, they referred that in the brothels they had better amenities as compared to the shelter homes. And then then I started to reflect that whether these rescue traffic victims are actually quote unquote rescue traffic victims. Holding victimhood and agency together rather than choosing between them was the paper's central feature. It is in this light that I read the Supreme Court judgment versus Prajwala Union of India, because it answers from the bench of the very question that the various contributors of this issue has brought to the ground. The court definitely rejects the binary of innocent victim and guilty participant, holding that vulnerability and agency coexist in the same person. It mandates a threshold inquiry to distinguish traffic victims from voluntary adult sex workers, makes the victim's own consent the governing principle in detention and rehabilitation, and calls for an end to mass raids and for trauma-informed procedure throughout. Set against the shelter home I studied, its locked gates, justified as protection, its moral judgments substituting for any real inquiry into what women wanted. This is precisely the shift my paper had argued for: consent and testimony, not institutional convenience deciding a woman's fate. But what I would also speak in conjunction with Professor Numai, who rightly said that whether this judgment would be adequately implemented or would apply to the entire Northeast fabric, because the social fabric of Northeast is very diverse, and whether a uniform kind of judgment will be applicable in the Northeastern context. And also, I would refer to Kim's argument that when we lay the final judgment, that whether the sex worker or the traffic victim was a sex worker or a traffic victim, who gives the judgment? Whether it's the women themselves, whether the judgment is saying that the women themselves will be the one who would be saying that, no, I was not trafficked, or I am a voluntary sex worker. Who decides that? Is a central question that we should be discussing at this point. And nearly a decade on, the underlying question has only grown more urgent, and whether this judgment would be able to capture what the questions that we were raising. That's what we will see in the coming years, and whether it will be implemented in the way it should be. However, on a positive note, it is heartening to see that at least it embedded a legal framework rather than left to the institutional directions. Yes, there is still the question of whether the sex worker's consent would really be taken into account. As the law moves towards recognizing that dignity, it requires listening to the survivors. Now, scholarship's task is to ensure whether this translates into practice, and that consent is generally sought, rehabilitation individualized, and the women passing through these systems are treated as authors of their own futures. That to me remains the unfinished task of anti-trafficking scholarship, not simply to document rescue, but to keep faith with the women whose voices rescue so often claims to speak for. And in the end, I would like to say that it's a great deal of a satisfaction that the project that we started, all of us started, came in a form of a judgment, and that we just did not went and documented their stories and did whatever publications or whatever. We I'm really satisfied that at least it's going back to the sex workers or the traffic victims, and it is one of my life's greatest satisfaction that this is what I mean. I was always disturbed by this question that, and the stories that I document really disturbs me till now. And I'm at least a little satisfied that the work that all of us had done had really makes sense, and at least there will be an effort, even if minuscule, that a concern or a thought that we have to take into the account of consent. At least the discussion on consent has come into the purview. That's what I'm really happy about. And with that, I would like to thank EPW and also Professor Cherry. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Parnali Das, for such a wonderful presentation and also doing an anatomy of the whole idea of rescue. We are also very pleased to know that as a young researcher, you published this with EPW. It encourages other researchers also to indulge in such critical scholarship and publish results. I now request Dr. Baitali Ganguly to please make a presentation.
I will just want to reflect some of my feeling and some of my learning, what I got at that point of time when I wrote that thing in 2016. Actually, I am from a non-profit organization named Prajwala, who worked on the adolescent and young women of red light areas of Kolkata from 1992. And we focus on trafficking based on our experience in 1998 and opened the shelter home in 2006. Actually, I recall the period between 2008 and 2012 when I rushed to Howrah station almost every day to receive the rescued victims from Mumbai and the Pune, the brothel in Kamakipura and Budhwar. The thing is this, court sent them to Prajwala for the economic rehabilitation. See, I had the opportunity to meet the girls, an extensive interview with different shelter homes along with the Prajwala's shelter home. And what I found there, that are the Bangladeshi, and usually they have been rescued in Mumbai whenever they speak Bengali. So there are women from West Bengal too, who were detained in the shelter home as Bangladeshi, and they've been tortured. That's the huge area of concern. And most of the time when I dialoguing with the victims, they usually say, oh, I spent so many time in Mumbai, I spent in jail. They never consider the shelter home as a good place. They consider them as a jail, as a cage. So that's the area of my concern. And most of the Bangladesh, as I meet the Bangladeshi and the West Bengal women, and the situation, though I wrote about Bangladeshi repatriation, but this thing is equally true for West Bengal also. The scenario, what I found, what I wrote, all are equally true for West Bengal one. The thing is, Bangladeshi women are very hesitant to speak about their original address and real address. So I have to rush to Bangladesh to meet their parents, to identify the real means and most of them don't have their legal documents. So, and I found what sort of vulnerabilities they had. And that I did basically to expedite and facilitate the repatriation. And I had the opportunity to dialoguing with them. And as I frequently conducted those interviews, that provided me with the introspection for my work. I have learned about the victims' vulnerabilities they often face. That there are the vulnerabilities for the intergenerations, that is generational illiteracy, unstable marriage, and there is an unmatched desire and expectations for the young people. And they're mostly what women I meet, they're mainly the 19 to 24 years. I'm not talking about the 16 years or anyone else, the minor I'm not talking about here, but as we're talking about the agencies, because the underage is the criminal part, the crime part, so I'm not focusing on that. And the most important part is the lack of opportunities. They're surrounded by the different types, different levels of exploitation. I found many people around them, but I never found a single person as support person, real support person. I found people who were waiting around and surrounded by the victim, waiting for the supports, financial support. And that's the need very much. I'm not talking about the utter poverty I found there in the, and most of them, even the girls I found in Bangladesh border, the West Bengal one, they are also considered Mumbai, Delhi, and Bangalore as a dream place. So, and I also learned apart from all this, I found their vulnerabilities, their exploitation, their whatever the tragedy is there that I observed. But I also learned that really, even after they're originally trafficked, they're physically tortured, mentally exploited, but they accepted all those experiences as their part of life. And they are eager to join the flesh trade. Again, that usually the government and the other people, the NGOs like us, call the re-trafficking. But that I don't consider as the re-trafficking. That is basically, they don't have any opportunity, any opportunity for their dignified or a sustainable, some sort of livelihood, some income by which they can live their life. And the victims' rights, needs, expectations, desires are erased during the raid and rescue operation. And I feel that if that is true, why should we characterize the trafficked individual as helpless victim? I think they are the warrior. Instead, we must understand the complex layers of victims' lives and it's a systemic lack of opportunities they face. And unfortunately, still today, I observe the situation have not changed much in last 10 years. Despite the increased involvement of government and other stakeholders, yes, nowadays the Easter events are in past with the NGOs, the other stakeholders did lot of work for the speedy repatriation or to support them. But at present time, government is doing everything. It's not we. And they don't hear any civil society's voice, any other's voice. But this is really, really good that the Prajwala and the Supreme Court had time to read these things, and they consider that these are very important to hear the other corner of the society. And so I think if we want to address commercial sexual exploitation effectively, we must prioritize the dignity, the word dignity, the constitutional rights of trafficked survivors. And move beyond, we have to move beyond the narrow rescue framework, raid, rescue, and harassment in name of legal support. So that's all. We have to think very seriously. Thank you. I don't want to speak much. I want some of my reflection. That's
Thank
all.
you.
Thank you. I think, Jerry, I'm
Thank
able
you.
to finish by 4 minutes.
Thank you, Vaishali Ganguly, for this important presentation and sharing 3 decades of field experience with us. I now request Dr. Paula Banerjee to make a presentation.
Good evening from my part of the world, which is Southeast Asia. And a huge thank you to EPW. And of course, another big hug and thank you to Professor Geraldine Forbes, who had made this possible. This whole issue, I have gone through the Supreme Court judgment. It has named two scholars or two presenters. But I think whatever we wrote, somebody, maybe not the justices, but their clerks, somebody did read it, which is, something which is very positive for us. This is a beginning, albeit a very flawed beginning. Now we come to the topic of interest, that is trafficking. There are a couple of things that we have to understand, and that is trafficking is merely a part of spectrum. And the spectrum, Shomita, we talked about was migration, is displacement. It's also people who are left behind. Because, for example, in around the same time when we were talking about trafficking, and this was a couple of years after Felani Khatun's death in the Bengal-Bangladesh border. And we spoke about, the victims of trafficking from Karbi Anglong. But the 50 women who were trafficked were actually among the survivors. The women who were left behind were actually killed. So, at the end of the day, trafficking is a transaction. Trafficking is something where there is a person and I think Ajay very clearly said, the trafficker is the neighbor. The trafficker is the auntie. The trafficker is the village sister. The trafficker is the boyfriend. So the traffickers are not unknown people. And traffickers to the women are much closer than the state. I will take our discussion, I will make the connections and take our discussions to a broader level, and I will talk about the borders. So transport it to the international level as well, because today, when I speak, I also have experiences from another border, another region of trafficking, that is Southeast Asia. At that time, when I was writing the paper, it was on South Asia. And, I will not get into very, very silly differentiations of smuggling and trafficking and all of that. The world over, what we do is to sort of infantilize the entire process. And the state is also a player, the market is also a player. Border is the place through which trafficking happens. And in this case, I will talk about the international border, because it is also a region of endemic violence. And this violence is also consciously done by both sides of the states. So it is not one state, but it is both the states that make these regions of violence, and people, state-like institutions participate in it, and women are victimized and their agency is forgotten. One thing, for example, I have to mention the Global Compact on trafficking, on migration and refugees. Because the Global Compact, when it talks about migration, it says safe, orderly, regular migration. Who in hell would say that I want to be an unsafe, a disorderly, and an irregular migrant? Migrants become irregular, unsafe, disorderly, because that is how the legal regime has pushed them into a situation. So when they cross the international border, we have to realize that when we talk about traffickers, there is not one primordial trafficker. There are multiple traffickers. So in one passage, women have 6 traffickers, 7 traffickers, and it keeps changing hands. It is a business. It is a transaction. Women are not mere victims. They are victimized in this process, because this process is a continuum of violence, but they're not mere victim. I think Bornali talked about women's agency. Boitali talks incessantly about women choosing. when women do not have safe passageways in every situation of conflict, in every situation of climate change, why is there more trafficking? Because we do not make the passageways safe for women. It is a conscious will that makes these passageways unsafe across borders, which are masculinized, which are militarized, which are made violent. So, this Supreme Court judgment is, albeit a beginning, but it's a very flawed beginning. We understand that, but it is a beginning, and we can take it on from there. So, people who are trafficked, please do not always conflate it with, just because much of them are women, do not conflate it with sex work. Most of these women are being trafficked for labor, and for them, sex work is also labor. In this, when we look at the southern cities of the global south, we see that people are pushed into it. Somebody from this panel talked about, the whole process of trying to make labor, visible in this system. And that is very, very important, because when these people are being trafficked, they do it for labor. The government of Thailand, where I am settled now, is we are critical of it, because that is, the government is the only agency that can identify traffickers. So in a year, it identifies 4 traffickers or 5 traffickers, which is ridiculous. However, what is important is that the government recently recognized the reasons for trafficking and actually allowed displaced people from Myanmar, protracted displaced people from Myanmar, to take up jobs. In the last 3 months, there has been only 2,000 people getting jobs, but 2,000 people saved themselves from traffickers and could get jobs. So it is not the women who are trafficked that are to be criminalized, but law always criminalizes these women because they are easy. And the other thing is, there is this massive nervousness among lawmakers, among the state, about women's sexuality. If you at the law hospitals, if you look at the Contagious Disease Act, we will see it was that nervousness that the sexuality is actually polluting the British soldiers. The sexuality in Northeast India, there are so many articles written about garrisons where women prostitutes go and they actually corrupt the men there. I mean, every military garrison has a prostitute quarter attached to it. And it is not done by the prostitutes, it is done by the garrison builders who place these army and place prostitute quarters near it. This is a process that has started in the colonial period and is continued now. So it is facile to criminalize the people who are into the transaction of sex work. For them, they privilege labor even within sex work. So we have to understand that trafficking is not just an internal phenomena. Trafficking is a huge phenomena. It is a worldwide phenomena. And today, a lot of people come and, we are in the belly of the beast, the global south. This is where much of it is happening. But the donor world talks about trafficking only coming to their countries. That is not how the whole phenomena is to be addressed. And trafficking does not stop only with women. There are young boys, men who are also trafficked, who are also, victimized for, harvesting of their organs, etc. So we cannot separate trafficking from mobility, from migration, and also the, the will that says we have to control people who are, seen as subaltern, as, undisciplined and dangerous. So these dangerous bodies have somehow to be controlled. And today, when in the Middle East war is going on, a war of choice, and thousands are women, of women have to take recourse to traffickers, how can we say that the traffickers are actually perpetrators and the women are the victims? They're not. They choose it for their lives. So they choose it because they want to live. They want to survive. It is a mechanism of survival for them. We have to recognize that. So unless if internationally we make safe passageways for migration, for labor, we can never address trafficking. And also we have to recognize sex work as work, because it is hard labor, it is dangerous labor, it is violent labor, but it is labor. Shweta, I'm sorry you've showed me the time sign, so I conclude here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that powerful presentation and reiterating the importance of the issue of labor in this whole process, the international politics of global South and global North, and also the issue of migration. I now invite the chair of the session, Dr. Geraldine Forbes, to share her thoughts and concluding views on this presentation.
So thank you, and I hope the people listening to us understand why I really liked working with the authors of these articles. As I started out, I'm a historian, not an anthropologist, sociologist, political scientist, not with the same understanding. I have learned from all these people, and I think it speaks to what I said in the beginning. When we began, I began with students to look at trafficking and how various agencies in India, government and non-government, responded to sex trafficking. I met and read things by some of these women and others, and I really I'm happy that so many of you heard from them and sort of sense what I have learned from other people about how complicated the topic is, and how I think, as so many, I mean, Paula has just pointed out that if we, maybe she didn't use this term, but if we didn't talk to, if we called, sometimes people talk about labor contractors, or those of us who have more money hire travel agents to go from one place to another. When poor, vulnerable women, as Paula talked about, victims of, and somebody in the chat brought up environmental degradation, Paula's talking about war and conflicts. When people migrate under those circumstances, we might say they aren't in a position to get a travel agent, and they're not actually having a labor contractor. The people who transport them are called traffickers. I was going to say, when we think on the southern border, we talk about coyotes. These are for in the anti-trafficking world, these are the bad, evil people. In the eyes of some of those people who want to move or have to move, these people are the ones, I think, as Paula so well pointed out, are the ones they turn to. And I think there's so much in these different articles that tells us to look, to just keep questioning and asking questions, and look beyond any kind of simple way of dealing with this. Right. So thank you. And I think you wanted to turn it over to questions. I think there are lots of people who've mentioned in the chat, and maybe some people who want to speak. So Sweta, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, if anyone from the panel wants to speak or share or discuss, please. A lot of questions, I think, have already been answered in the presentation. So I invite any of the panelists if they have any queries.
Is there?
Sorry, Shweta, what did you invite us for?
If you have any, concluding thoughts or comments to make, please feel free to. So, if anything that was left out in the presentation.
I don't know if everyone's had it. I've just barely looked at the chat. So is there anything you want to raise from comments in the chat?
From the chat, there are many participants asking how to access to all these articles because they really want to read it. I would say please go to the EPW website and click on the Review of Women's Studies 2016 issue, where you'll find all the articles.
I can say just one thing. With this group of authors, I think it's time now for EPW to think of another special issue.
That we certainly consider that because it's been also a decade, and
I would urge you to think of another special issue.
Certainly. We have already, we are already running short of time. So we'll be uploading this on YouTube. So if participants have more questions, they can certainly ask this in our YouTube comment section. And if someone is kind enough, they can come and reply there as well. There is one question from a historical perspective. How did cultural, sorry. Okay,
I don't know if we have
trafficking and sexual exploitation exist in organized forms within rural society. This is a different question. Does anyone want to answer? Was there a different kind of trafficking involved in rural society?
Boitali, unmute. I think Boitali's answering. Boitali?
No, it's not.
Yeah.
It's not that. Can I hear the question again, very specifically? Shumita,
historically, if there was another form of trafficking, the white slave trade or something like that.
The question is about rural society, and the answer is yes. Not only yes, but a resounding yes. Because the whole process of urbanization happened with rural-urban migration, right? So when brothels grew up in these modern cities, whether it's Calcutta, Bombay, or whatever the colonial cities, they happened with rural migration. And we know from census that that is actually a very important area which we need to explore further, that what are the different process of migration which constituted these different labor segments. So sex work, for instance, was primarily constituted by single women migration, and which is a rare thing in the 19th century in rural-urban migration. So who were these single women? What was the mode of their mobilization? Who were the intermediaries? When Paula says some people become traffic victims and some people become traffickers, some people become sex workers. And when Ajay says it is the people in the community, that is exactly the point, that the same processes, sex trafficking is not a thing apart. The person who is being trafficked or is being assisted for migration may end up in the city either as a domestic worker or a sex worker. So these are not channels that are separate. These are similar channels where outcomes may differ. Right, so you don't.
And also one form changes into another.
Yes.
A domestic worker in
And
COVID time became a sex worker.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Another thing,
Some sex worker, when she grows older, becomes a domestic worker.
yeah.
Domestic workers are raped and they become sex workers.
Yeah,
so these are not separate channels, and that is actually one of the most important things which we need to look at.
Yeah, and other thing I want to add with Shamita and Paula, the form of trafficking also change. It's not the girls and women are coming. It's an exodus from the rural to urban, and they're coming to the urban areas very frequent, and there is no work. Even the construction work, they join as a construction work assistant. But they have been used and sexually exploited. Then they thought, I made many of this type. They made and they told me, why do I give sex, sexually exploited? Why not earn more out of this? So they joined the sex trade directly. and there is no documentation of any migration. Paula, I want to add, along with your unsafe migration, that is undocumented. There is no document, and people consider that the other people consider that the cattle. So they are coming to the from rural to urban, Kolkata, and here from to other places, Bangalore and other places. The commercial sexual exploitation is really a journey. It's a journey and it's a process. It's a process.
Boitali, what I want to sort of re-emphasize is that sex work is also work. I mean, and all of these changes, a hospital ayah, who is, dealing with medical waste, when she's thrown out of jobs, she gets into the domestic work sector. She might get into the sex work sector. So these are all gray areas. And me, Rajat, and Shangvida, three people, recently it came out in a book on City as a Southern Question. We also did the historical work about, all these migrants coming into cities and becoming sex workers. What
very
backhand is
right.
termed as, unregistered sex workers. And it is very interesting because all these people who are keeping the records say that they became registered sex workers, then after 2 months they disappeared. Where did they go? We cannot find them. And they say this happens maximum with women from Midnapur or, some such place.
Very right.
Women came together and then they disappeared. I mean, these are such interesting documents. And if you look at the historical record and if you look at present day, certain things have changed, but there are many things, that have remained the same. What has changed is the phenomena of the borders. Borders were not so violent, not so masculine, not so militarized at that point of time.
So
these
Paula,
borders are created.
Yeah, right. Paula, what do you think? This term, all this jargon, the rescue, raids, re-trafficking, all these words need to be relooked and redefined rather?
Absolutely. And the other thing that I am very strong about is that the rescue is, if it's rescue or the changes in the life of women, if they decide to changes, is done here. We often, whenever internationally you talk about CNN, blah, 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 Freedom Project, you talk about it, you make it sound as if, gods and goddesses from the global north come and change the world. That is not how this is done. This can only be done internally. I mean, sorry, Jerry and Kimberly, it is not against anybody in particular, but the whole phenomena is painted as if the women from the global South, Asia, and Africa are over-sexualized, attracting people. It is because it is how these places become the phenomena of global prostitution rings, etc. And this is how from here, all the sex workers are going to the global north. That is not what happens. Women from this part of the world stays in this part of the world. And if there are changes happen here.
Changes happen from. And
we have sisterhoods with women from all over the world who are activists, who come and join us, but changes happen here.
And if I could slightly, move away from the narrative of sex trafficking, and the term that when I was researching on human and sex trafficking, it just clicked to me the term called khupadhara. In Assamese, it means somebody who will just forcibly kidnap you and take you. And this narrative we had from, like, if you have to scare a child, you just have to say that the khupadhara is coming, meaning khupa means this and hara means somebody will catch you. And organ trafficking was always in the part of the narrative of, in our knowledge, organ trafficking was always there. But when I was going through the literature of human trafficking, it said that organ trafficking has been added in the later part of discussing about human trafficking. But organ trafficking was always there. That's what like Paula has also mentioned, that that thing that it is very new edition is new from a certain perspective, from the perspective of Assam, or in certain parts it's not a new perspective. It was always there in the narrative of quote unquote in the society that I am, that Khopa Dhora was always there. And this is very interesting part when we talk about the history of human trafficking per se, because it instantly took my reflection on, or questioned the idea that organ trafficking is a new edition. When you see the literature, it says that it's a new edition. And also I wanted to add that the question that developed in my paper was not something that I went with that question in mind. And it's also again a critique to the methodology, which says that you have to set everything has to be tight, and things will go. But it was a field that gave me my the question that the field had given me. And that's what methodology is, very research methodology, which we say is very we can critique it in various ways. And this is from a lived experience of a researcher whose research question came from the field. Thank you. I wanted to mention that.
I just wish to mention about the shelter home, whether shelter home create real empowerment. I know the work of Kimberly Walters and Pranali Das that look at the shelter home critically, and that's also very important. And that's why Supreme Court has also cited their work. But at the same time, if we look at Prajwala shelter home, I have been there a couple of times. It's a space, I perceive it as a space for empowerment. Although they lead a disciplined life, obviously being in a shelter home, they have to get up at certain time, but their financial stability has been taken. Their bank accounts are being opened, and they have a time for music, they have time for family, in the sense like women who have children can also spend quality time, and the children are also given education. They have vocational trainings that are going on in full swing in Hyderabad. So I feel that shelter homes like this, Prajwala shelter home, is a space that creates real empowerment. Although on the other side of the river, my own colleagues, my co-panelists, colleagues here have mentioned the critical aspects. The other thing that I want to mention is how survivors return to vulnerable conditions, even after rescue and rehabilitation, is also because in India, particularly in the northeastern part of India, we all know that Manipur is burning today. Earlier, it was Kuki and Meitei. Today, Nagas have come. So it's a triangle conflict that we are facing today, but the world is not talking about that. And how many women and girls have been trafficked from Manipur to not only India, but to other parts of the world because of the vulnerability and also cross-border illegal migration going on. And women are being pushed out of the state to different parts of the country and different parts of the world. Now, I tell you that vulnerability of these people continues because the structural inequality is not being addressed successfully. There is conflict, as Paula is an expert, and she has mentioned about the cross-border issue. There is violence where women become victims, continue to be harassed, continue to be molested, continue to be sexually exploited, continue to be traumatized in a way that human rights people can't even address it properly today. The UN is also not able to address the voices of these women. So the structural inequality of conflict, violence, cross-border migration with the open border in the Northeast, and also poverty, caste, racial discrimination, social exclusion, these are not addressed. Therefore, these women who were rehabilitated, these women who were rescued, continue to be in the vulnerable conditions. And we see
that is the thing. The discourse is about people becoming vulnerable after migration. But actually it is the vulnerability that pushes them into unsafe migration.
That's what I mean to say, that the vulnerability that pushes them, when they're reintegrated, reunited with their family, they still go back to the vulnerable condition because the structural inequality of our society is not addressed. And therefore, we need to hit the bullet by looking at those issues carefully.
That's why we have to question the reintegration. They two words are different. One is restoration and another is reintegration. We usually call the reintegration, which is not, which is totally is a fake word. I think we have to question the reintegration very seriously.
Yes,
even
and
after this, even after the pandemic, there's the legal support. A lot of things are there. And what is reintegration? And we call that so many people, 5,000 reintegrated. Rehabilitation, you cannot think of that. That requires 10 years.
Yeah, I also
Not less than that.
propose what Paula proposed earlier to EPW. We request EPW to bring out a special volume where we all will look into the research gap in the contemporary time.
After 10 years of this.
This is a real celebration after 10 years. And I request Jerry to take us in her boat again, in the ship.
I like to edit. No, I thank you. All right, for actually some really impassioned comments and discussion today. I think I think the Supreme Court decision has us all looking again at what we wrote, what's gone on in the past, and I thank you for pointing out, Kim, like lots of issues. I think we all in reading it said, yeah, they don't address this, they don't address this. And I think that comment like this is a start. Listening to you, I was thinking about, all right, and I haven't kept in touch with him, a young man I met a couple of years ago who was doing his research on rural women's in prostitution. What was really interesting and speaks to what Boitali says is they all want to go to the city, not to be rescued, but it was also turning to prostitution or sex work out of desperation, like absolutely, like they had children to raise, they had no other work, right? They had no other work, or maybe they could have. I mean, Boitali and I know some of these. We know young women and how much they can make in rural areas. Just really nothing. And if they're trying to support families, it doesn't work. And what he was telling me he'd found interviewing these women, they all dreamed, I hate to say this, they dreamed about being in Kolkata and being able to be associated with Durbar. Because they saw like a sex workers union as flawed and problematic as situations are for people in Shonagachi and part of Durbar as flawed, and we all know that some of that literature. At the same time, this was their dream, the city and being associated. The dream was not that there could be some kind of rescue, right? I just have to comment something Paula said, and this is certainly in the Western world after the TIP report and so on. Okay, trafficking is still a big issue in America, but it also is foreigners. And if you think about some of the things, okay, Christoph's writing about it, the book, the movie, and so on and so on.
Slavery,
Again,
the new forms of slavery.
And then we've got the Kevin Bales, the new slavery. We've got things like I was thinking about Born into Brothels, which won the Academy Award.
Oh my goodness,
which
yes.
Actually doesn't. It talks about these young girls as potentially, I think this is what I got out of it, they're going to be trafficked by their mothers into sex work. And then and I was thinking, isn't it Lindsay Loman who went in for a BBC movie and in some Twitter post said, today I rescued 400 young girls. All right, I mean, so there's a Western rescue that is kind of a continuation of colonialism. And actually just now there is, and Kim probably knows more about this, in Los Angeles, going into a street where there are a lot of young prostitutes. I just read today they arrested 4 men. All right. So really, this is supposed to be a major enterprise, and as we know, it doesn't matter what country, traffickers are rarely convicted. It's just doesn't happen. So I think I really appreciate EPW giving us all the chance. I have certainly enjoyed listening to all of you. I mean, it's as exciting as your articles were, whatever, 10 years ago. I still have the files where I corresponded with you, and what about the footnotes or something like this? So I still have all my old drafts of different papers, but thank you so much. I think, does EPW, Sweta, do you want to make just some final comments as we sign off?
Can I make some final concluding points? First of all, thank you, our panelists and participants, for such an enriching discussion. It has not only added a depth to our understanding of this issue, but also the sensitivity required at the policy level. At this moment in time, when we are re-looking at the Supreme Court judgment with a lot of hope, critical reading, and also caution, I'm reminded of a Toni Morrison quote that the purpose of freedom is to free somebody else. If you have power, you have to empower somebody else. We hope that the scholarship in EPW and the discourses and practices built around it contributes to this empowerment and also questions the very category of empowerment. I thank Dr. Forbes and the panelists for joining us today. I also request all our viewers to please watch out the EPW print and digital space to engage more with this subject. Not only read the 2016 issue, but other authors published in EPW and beyond. With this, I thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.